Go find it. I'm going to do my best not to just sort of stare at the screen reader or stare at the captioning the entire time and be fascinated by what it does and doesn't pick up.
I know. Great. So I think maybe let's talk a little bit about why this panel first. Like what kind of brought us to talking about this subject today? Maybe as like a little bit of an introduction.
Do you want to go through the first couple slides? I think the third one is sort of that one, and there's a brief sort of who we are and what we're doing here.
Sounds perfect. Yeah. All right. So who we are.
Yeah. Exist. I'm Jay Edidin. I'm a writer. I'm an editor and podcaster. I also have done over the years a lot of unofficial and official mentoring and youth advocacy work with trans youth and queer youth. And I am a huge X-Men fan, which is sort of where this panel loops those things together. Dani?
Yeah, so my name is Dani Kinney. I am a critic, artist, sometimes amateur writer, and community organizer. I daylight as the logistics coordinator of a trans health conference, and I've been working with trans youth in a number of capacities throughout my current work and beyond. And yeah, I'm also overly committed to the X-Men. So should be no surprise why we're talking about this. So I think first it would help for us to clarify what this isn't, to kind of manage some expectations.
Right.
So obviously first, I think especially with Jay on the panel, there's a potential for folks that hope for us to get into hyper-specific continuity, which this isn't really going to be about.
No. We're probably going to make errors, and we're probably not going to apologize for them. This is looking at the broader metaphor and basically stuff like that. It's also not going to be story hour. Both of us have done work with trans youth. Both of us feel very, very strongly about respecting confidentiality in those contexts. So we're going to be pretty much discussing this entirely in theoretical terms.
And obviously, I think the ground has been well covered in terms of why Charles Entertainment Xavier is a insufficient mentor and role model for mutant youth. It's so minimal are his contributions to the positive side of this conversation that it need not be remarked upon, I feel. So if anyone was hoping for a dunk session on Charles Xavier, it won't happen here, but that's what my Twitter account is for. So.
Yes, likewise.
So what this is an exploration of kind of three big questions that we sort of landed on as we were planning this panel. So the first one, when we're looking at real life mentoring dilemmas, how can we use fiction and comics as a tool, specifically in this context, the mutant metaphor, which is, almost overtly politicized and really lends itself to that kind of analysis.
And the second question is where and how we can turn to comics to sort of frame the situations we're facing when we don't have usable real life antecedents. One of the realities of growing up and growing into being a queer or trans elder is that a lot of our history and a lot of our recent generations are missing. And we don't necessarily have the kind of generational mentorship network that we would hope to under these circumstances. So we're turning to and looking for role models, not only in the real world around us, of which there are still many, but, in terms of the fiction that we found meaning in as well.
Yeah. And I think the kind of overarching theme that kind of blankets this conversation is like, how do we use those metaphors productively and responsibly? I think if you're going to talk about the mutant metaphor, like the first thing we need to acknowledge is that it can be really flawed and really incomplete. And I think that there are exciting things to be found in those moments where the metaphor breaks down. But in terms of mapping that to a sort of skills building exercise like this, it can be really dangerous to take certain aspects of the mutant metaphor a little bit further, partially because none of us can shoot concussive beams out of our eyes. So there's a limit to what we can actually account for.
Despite our best efforts.
Yes. I try every Sunday to kind of force them out, and they still just don't happen for me. So the first kind of larger topic we could dig into, and I should also say, like, as we're kind of getting into this, if you have questions, thoughts, feel free to like throw them in the Q&A section. We're going to kind of try to incorporate them as we go, so that way, like, we can kind of instigate a conversation that is not necessarily wholly determined by Jay and I, but can feel a little bit more collaborative and collective based.
Yeah, and Dani, since you're keeping tabs on the slides, if you want, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A.
Groovy.
See what there is to tie in.
Excellent. So I think with as many mutant generations as there are, and how many of them kind of really overlap in inconsistent and somewhat messy ways at times, the idea of mentorship often puts into very stark contrast the fact that most of the people who are trying to be the adult in the room really lacked that kind of support in their own upbringing and lacked that kind of nourishment. And, you know, I threw this image of Gabby and Laura on there because that has always been a relationship that, for me, specifically in Tom Taylor's All New Wolverine, like, really, it really gets at a dynamic that I think makes some of this stuff really explicit. And you see Laura, like, really visibly struggling with these things. And Tom Taylor has done, like, a really excellent job in some of the ways that that's been scripted, because there will be these moments of compare and contrast of different, like, and sometimes literally different scenes where, like, Gabby is coming to Laura for the same types of things that Laura needed when she was kind of the mentee, the child, looking to Logan for those same things, and using that lack of emotional nourishment from Logan to kind of inform how she's going to approach Gabby. And that can be really challenging. Jay, what do you think?
I think the other thing that really gets highlighted here, and that Marvel Time, for all of its flaws, makes a better metaphor, is the situation of also being a chronological elder who's not necessarily more experienced in being trans or being out as trans or experiencing transition. That's another place where I think the Laura-Gabby relationship is a really good one, because you've got two characters who aren't very far apart in age, and one of whom, and the younger of whom, is much, much more able to articulate what she needs and able to articulate kind of how she's going about and thinking of the stuff that's going on around her than the older one is necessarily to know to offer it. And that mutuality is something that I think is a really, really good example of sort of a healthy way to approach that situation. Another place that I'll go to a lot for that is Christina Strange Generation X, but I think we're going to get there a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that's a relationship that we see a lot within the trans community, specifically because, for various reasons, I think, I mean, we all come out in our own way at our own time, and we do find that some folks land a little bit later in their life with those things, and some folks are coming out, like, very early in life. And, you know, I personally have learned so much from, like, younger trans femmes, where it's like, I don't know how to, like, navigate this part of my transition, or, like, nobody taught me this. And so, like, there's that element of, like, I'm, in terms of measuring temporal persistence on this earth, I'm older, but I have so much less experience. And I think, to some extent, much like the mutant metaphor, like, that embraces a really intense collectivism. And it can, in really exciting moments, it can break down those sorts of barriers about, you know, who it is that we're looking to nourish us, to give us information. But it can be a really big challenge when, like, youth look to me and I'm still trying to figure out, like, okay, I guess I'm in a position where I'm trying to fill the needs of somebody that, like, maybe this didn't even occur to me as a need for myself.
Yeah.
I'm only finding it because I'm being asked. And I think that's another really, I think about Jubilee and we'll get to this for sure, in Generation X. And I was just rereading the first volume this morning, and, like, I feel like that's something that's very present in Jubilee, uncovering that like there are very real things that she didn't know to ask for, and is only finding those things because people are asking her for that stuff now.
The other thing that I kind of want to talk about there is trans youth and gender nonconforming youth and youth in general have access to a range of ideas and language that just weren't there 10 or 15 years ago. The difference between, and I mean, even coming into those conversations as someone who stays relatively abreast of that stuff, feels like coming into a situation where I'm a non-native speaker and there are a bunch of kids who grew up with those terms. And again, that generational difference is really exciting, and one of the cooler things that I think is we're running to catch up with, because we've got to go back to the metaphor, you know, a generation of us who grew up just thinking there was something wrong, and then all of these kids who can speak fluently about X genes and, you know, categories of mutation and the politics around them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to even look at the way that the mutants kind of emerge, where like the first generations are really, you know, they go to the school, but we see them more often than not as a sort of direct action, somewhat militant force. And it's over time, as the resources are built up, as the competencies are built up, that we see the school in some runs versus others building out into a more social and emotionally nourishing environment.
Which actually perfectly segues to the next slide. So looking at, because the school at first was entirely reactive, and it was entirely about taking kids and throwing them directly into the field. And then we see sort of the question of survival versus thriving coming up, starting first in early X Factor when they pull in the kids there, but across other teams and across other books. And so sort of the question of what it means to prepare kids for battles, to prepare kids for a hostile world, while recognizing that kids shouldn't have to be prepared for that stuff. That when you're talking about, you know, preparing mutants to grow up in a world that hates and fears them, the fact that the world hates and fears them is fundamentally wrong, and these aren't things kids should have to grow up feeling like they need to compensate for.
Yeah, and I think a lot about this particular part when I read and reread New X-Men Childhood's End. It's sort of the arc that picks up right after M-Day, the decimation, where everyone loses, well, not everyone, where a majority of mutants lose their abilities. And Emma's reaction there is really interesting, because Emma has this really intense history of engaging in that kind of adultification of mutants. And it's really interesting because Emma is one of the folks who you will see the most vocal. I mean, how many times has she referenced, like, she's doing this for the kids once more again for the children? Like, it's at the center of her mind and her heart, but there's so often this reaction to kind of react to trauma and react to the threat by cutting short a sense of youth and safety by saying, like, you know, and I see this so poignantly in the Danger Room scene, where Emma reacts to this communal trauma by saying, okay, these kids, they're just not ready. So we need to get them ready. We need to make them into soldiers who can handle this fight. And, you know, even Scott pushes up against that a little bit and tries to consider how forcing these students against each other, forcing them to fight each other for spots on a team, isn't really building power and isn't building community. It's re-perpetuating a sense of trauma, I think.
Yeah, and getting out of those of trauma is sort of one of the questions I think that we perpetually face as transgenders. That how you crack through, you know, if you this segues into the first question we've got, which is how do you take care of your own mental health while mentoring, but how we heal ourselves so that we don't perpetuate harm, and how we can use those harms to inform our own mentorship approaches beyond basically arming kids, metaphorically, or I guess literally, and beyond saying, and mentor in ways that go beyond preparing kids for the bad things that might happen.
Yeah, and this is interesting because it's one of those times where I'm not going to do story time, but I'm gonna maybe talk a little about like a value set that I employ, at least in more abstract terms, because this is something that for me, like, I really struggle with. So, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, taking on a very different type of position, I decided to get sober in the middle of it. And that threw a lot of my own mental health issues, I guess, into really stark contrast. And it was at the same time that I was starting to pilot a mentorship program. And this question is something that I'm kind of constantly grappling with. Like, how do I meet my own emotional needs and like essentially like reparent myself? Like, to some extent, trans elders are always in a process of kind of trying to reparent ourselves as we're trying to be mentors. And I think, you know, strategies that I always employ is like, first off, comics can be really fun. And I think that in this conversation, it would be remiss if I didn't say, like, comics are self-care to me. And like, that's a real thing that I always highlight to folks. Like, hey, you know, like, this is challenging. This is super rough, but you can also find things that like are really emotionally engaging and really like politically engaging, but are also like super connected to fun and joy. And I think that's where, you know, using the heart, like the idea of like taking what has been done to us and helping that to inform our reactions to youth is really important, because I know that I'm always responding to the fact that like I've felt inherently politicized, and that burns people out. And like, there are very few folks who are teaching kids how to be politically active in stable and sustainable ways. And that's so necessary, though.
It's absolutely critical. Automatic politicization is something we talked about when we were planning for this panel, as specifically a place where the X-Men really, really tie in to our own experiences, because for a long, long time, the Xavier School was basically a feeder school for the X-Men. And it periodically becomes that again. And when you're trans, and especially I suspect and have you know heard and seen, when you're growing up and you're younger and have a trans identity, you are thrust automatically. Wow, the captioning captioned trans identity as translating Hindi. That's amazing.
Maybe.
But
maybe.
Wow. No, but so when you're growing up, trans, there's so much of your just life experience and childhood and private life that's treated as inherently political, and you're thrust into the position of having to enter into political battles and social battles just to be able to lead a life. And sense, I think, especially in activist circles, but also in marginalized communities, of obligation there, that if you're in a position to do that, you have to, and you should, and you owe it to your community to do that. And I think especially when it comes to youth, that's a position that's worth challenging.
Yeah, I always think about this idea of like compulsory participation in like trans politics. And I think one of the things as elders is like, we always have to ask ourselves, like, what's the distinction between making youth politically aware and making them feel politically obligated? Because I look specifically, I look at this summer's wave of anti-trans legislation, and the sheer volume and rapid escalation of this legislation is more or less, in some regard, historically unprecedented. And we saw a lot of organizations and a lot of activists increasingly politicizing trans youth and like encouraging them to mobilize and organize, but really not often stopping to consider like what that cutoff point needs to be. And so you've got trans youth, like brave, truly amazing, inspiring people standing up in front of Congress and like in court hearings. And I can't help but feel a sense of like deep breaking in my heart for that. And part of me wonders like how can we preserve their sense of distance from this? And I think that's a question that I'm always grappling with.
I mean, going back to the Laura and Gabby metaphor, I think part of what we can do, and a really important thing we can do, is teach them to ask more of the people around them, both of us as adults in those situations and of cisgender adults and peers. Like, I want to see the parents of cis kids standing up and saying, this is bullshit, with the same volume that the parents of trans kids are. And I want to see, the children who are being held up as the think of the children example, saying, no, this isn't something that actually threatens me, rather than trans kids having to get up again and again and again and again in a hostile environment and context and justify their existence and their rights to really basic humanity.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this is where the metaphor breaks down, because these are not kids who are shooting concussive beams from their eyes. These are not kids who are walking through walls. These are not kids who have out of control, potentially dangerous mutations. These are humans in the baseline sense.
Yeah.
In terms of potential threat or in terms of political significance.
And it's that breakdown that I think is really worth examining a little bit, like, well, very deeply. But it's interesting because, as we look at the overlap, one of the big disconnects is the fact that mutants have a level of agency and autonomy that allows them to engage in what I would just characterize as broad militant direct action. Like, if somebody is a threat to them, they can easily turn to their friend who has metal claws and can't die, or they live on an island that literally can resurrect them. And like, there are safety nets that we don't have. And so I think we parse that out in terms of looking at like the metaphor has these moments where we can I've often deceived myself into thinking that I feel more powerful than I really am in certain respects. Mm-hmm. And I think that to some extent should help us kind of the pressure that we put on youth to do that. And I think, having the slide up that we have up right now, a conversation between Logan and Gambit that happens in the X-23 run about Logan's ability to mentor Laura versus Jubilee, kind of looking at that specific relationship, because Jubilee is somebody who has been through some of Logan's less ideal parts of mentorship, but really has been embraced with this sense of
childhood.
Like protecting an innocence in her that Laura is not really given. And Gambit, I love this run for so many reasons, but one of my favorite is because Gambit calls something out that like very few people around Logan have been able to say really succinctly. And it's that like you're throwing her into just more trauma. Like, and to some extent, I think that that's a risk we run. Like, we all run the risk of being Logan by being like, well, this is a hostile world. So, this is the best place that she can find a role. And asking ourselves, like, how can we challenge that is a really big question.
Yeah. How can we not, we look at mutation as a metaphor, and we look at and what automatically comes up is sort of the power to responsibility idea. But when we're looking at mutation again as a metaphor, what that ends up translating to is the idea that that marginalization translates to responsibility. And if we look at marginalization as translating to responsibility, that again, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the captions again.
We do have this financial responsibility.
We do. Marshall Lake Station is not really where I'd plan to go with this, but sorry.
No, you're good.
But no, if we look at, when we look at marginalization translating to responsibility, it means that to action, that the responsibility automatically falls on the shoulders of the furthest marginalized groups and people. And in the case of the trans community, that's youth, and especially trans youth of color.
Yeah.
And we say, you know, these things, we treat vectors of marginalization like they're superpowers, and how we discuss them, and how we in the language of empowerment around them. And I have really complicated feelings about that and major problems with it, because again, it translates right back to that marginalization comes with proportionate social responsibility, when it should be the exact inverse.
Yeah. I think there are some elements within the metaphor that I think kind of might articulate that. And I'm thinking specifically of the relationship between the mutants and the rest of the Marvel universe, specifically like the Avengers, because it's true. Like in terms of like community building and mutual aid, one of the like biggest lessons I've learned is like, you do not rely on the folks who are being marginalized to remedy their marginalization from within. You provide them resources, you empower them from outside, and you take on meaningful allyships to build power for them, and then hand that power off. And, you know, by expecting trans youth of color to solve their own problems, and by enforcing them with this false sense of agency and power to do so, we're setting them up for failure. And I think a lot about the way that other superhero teams function in relationship to the mutants, where, you know, the mutants are kind of assumed to be doing their own thing, taking care of their own problems, until Captain America doesn't like something and shows up, you know, on Utopia or, you know, at the Xavier School. And then there's a fight. And I often appreciate the times where they've called out the ways in which other superhero teams really fail to look after the mutants for that same reason of relying on them to remedy their own problems, because, you know, quote unquote, they have the powers to do so.
Yeah, those powers have limited reach within a matrix in which the community with them is that far in the margins. So I don't know if we can go into this in the slides, but I want to talk a little bit about Christina Strain's run on Generation X, because I feel like it's one of the first places where we get a model of mentorship that really deviates from a lot of the patterns that we've talked about, and that really recontextualizes, I'm trying to think of how to put this, that really recontextualizes the experience of childhood and recenters the mutant kids rather than the cause or the team or any of that stuff. And one of the critical aspects of it, I think, is that we've got a group of kids who are really being taught by the first generation of mutant youth who grew up in a vaguely functional school environment, or at least in a school environment where there was some degree of pressure, not exactly pressure, but support from the adults of separation of adult and kid responsibilities. The New Mutants had that to an extent, but they were so much an experimental class and so much an offshoot of an adult team that I think they lost a lot of that. And so the first Generation X is really the first place that you see that actual school environment trying to form, and doing so very, very imperfectly. But then those kids are themselves in positions of power finally in the next generation of Generation X. And what you see for the first time effectively is a class that's not about preparing for superhero life, and an approach to mentoring mutant kids that's not about preparing them for fights. And obviously it's a superhero comic, so they get into fights and that stuff happens, but it's not the center of the educational model that or the support model that we're seeing in there.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It feels like just a very significant shift.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also, I love, because the book itself it frames from the beginning that this is a group of mutants who, like, the X-Men, you know, not that they explicitly deem them not like fit for the team, but they're really a group and a collective whose express purpose is not to be a pipeline to the X-Men. And you see various folks on that team have really intense reactions to it. Like, I'm thinking of Quentin Quire, who takes that as an insult. And I really, because I've been thinking a lot about Quire in the past months, I think about the way in which that role and like those expectations were built into him. Yeah. And I think back to Grant Morrison, where, you know, there was this misplaced sense of almost like somebody had instilled upon Quentin Quire that there was a need to be politically active without really giving any clear expectations about what that meant. And so he takes on very reactionary roles to mobilize against wherever he is if he feels though he's not being utilized in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, if you look at him starting in Morrison, he's a great example of someone those systems have chronically failed. Because he's one of the longest term students at the Xavier School right now, and we're looking at Marvel time. And he gets shuffled around with ever really getting adequate levels of support or engagement, and has been for, you know, 20 odd years now. And this kind of segues us to another question that I want to address, which is RK asks, I know some trans kids who've had a really hard time going back to school because they don't pass. And it's big dysphoria there, and reminds me of the Morlocks hiding. What are your thoughts on helping those kids?
I think advocating for youth in schools is like a really big, it's a big consideration. And I think one of the things that I love this question because it throws a light on something that Jay and I talked a lot about in kind of planning, is when you're mobilizing, what to do should not take the shape of synthesizing an ideal solution. Because there's no kung fu neck grip to like, or like Vulcan neck pinch to like solving this problem, right? And so it's everywhere. Like there's a community need. So peers of that student, trans peers of that student have a role to fulfill. Cisgender peers of that student have a role to fulfill. School administrators have a role to fulfill. If this is a undergraduate level, high school level, there are like these different steps. And I think the really short answer is there's a lot that can be done, and it all requires a sense of accountability from each of those people. I think what we as elders can do, and that's kind of the position I feel most comfortable taking, is really helping them to understand their resources, helping to give them a plan. Because another thing is like respecting youth agency is really challenging, because you don't ever want to infantilize them, but you also want to respect their kids. And so that's a really hard dynamic. But I think empowering them to understand, you know, I always go to the make a list of people you can trust in that environment, delineate where those people fall in terms of hierarchies within the system of the school, and create a sense of communication through them, create a sense of accountability and check-in. Like I have that with a lot of folks who I organize with, where I know who to go to. I know to keep in touch with them, to keep abreast of like where they are, what they need. And it's really about like mutual aid outside of being material resources. It's about mutual aid of like an emotional and social nature.
Being a support resource in those contexts can be less about direct support and more about tangential things like educating other people, like providing resources to schools, like holding those schools accountable. There are a lot of ways to do that from a peripheral position that doesn't rob a student of agency, but does allow you to step in and take care of some of the stuff that shouldn't necessarily be on their shoulders. So again, education, resources, things like that. Like the extent to which if someone is in that position and just living their life and going through the day is a challenge, they shouldn't also be having to educate the people responsible for keeping them safe. They shouldn't be responsible for doing Trans 101 with educators, with administrators, with district parents. And that's really a place where we can step in.
Yeah. I also think like it takes being aware of, I mean, the first tool I always try to give people when they're building advocacy strategies is make a list, but make a list of your specific resources and privilege. Those are going to be huge. Like in your ability to advocate for anyone, anywhere, understanding what tools you can bring in are really important. Like as far as activists go, I don't consider myself to be a screwdriver. I'm a hammer, and I know that. And so I'm always bringing that to bear, where if somebody needs tactful organization of an institution, I know where my limits are. I know what I can do. I also know based on my identity, I am white. I have a public position at a major institution in the community that affords me certain privileges. And so I can leverage that. I can leverage against that school and say, if you're mistreating a student in this way, I can put this in front of X, Y, and Z people, and the community will be very vocal about this. And you can leverage your privileges in very deliberate and targeted ways, but it takes really having a full stock of your limitations and your resources.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, to bring it back to the mutant metaphor, you know, don't send X-Force out if you need things to be done with a measure of visibility.
Tact.
Yeah, tact. Speaking of X-Force, it's interesting because I'm thinking about Quentin Quire in the current run of X-Force, and some of the recent writing surrounding kind of unearthing that character. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Don't send X-Force to the high school because holes in walls. That's a general mutant problem. You don't want to send mutants to any high school because the walls will come down. They will not phone ahead. They will land the Blackbird on top of the school.
Or lurk outside in a convertible.
Yes. Or Magneto will show up or bring the school to him, simply lifting it off the ground, which could be ill-advised. There's insurance concerns there.
This is where the metaphor breaks down, but we wish it didn't.
Yes, true.
I want the powers. I want Trans Krakoa.
Oh. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I don't know around this topic. I personally, and Jay, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I haven't really come up with a lot of steady analysis of the way that this part of the metaphor, like advocating for youth, maps to Krakoa. And I think that that's really exciting to some extent, because it tells me that like we are proposing kind of like a different model of community building where, you know, youth's needs might be being met in more proactive and empowering ways. I look at that specifically in like the New Mutants book, but I'm curious what you think about that.
I mean, I think Krakoa is the well, in a perfect world qualifier that comes up in every single activist conversation. It's a resource base, it's a community base, it's having our own both refuge and staging ground and environment and co-op where we can if not entirely bypass, then at least phase out the discrimination and the other cultural and political factors. It's where we can say we can say there's this summer of horrible anti-trans legislation, and our island gives us not only a space to protect our kids from that, but leverage to challenge it on the international stage. Yeah. Like Krakoa is kind of Krakoa is the dream setting from which to be discussing all of this, but I think it's where the metaphor it's the place other than superpowers where the metaphor falls apart for largely the same reason, because it's something we don't, and I'm gonna optimistically say, yet have.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like Krakoa for me has taken on the role, kind of like mentioned at the bottom of this slide, is using comics as a tool for self-care and inspiration. Like I think I have felt really nourished by it in ways where X books haven't nourished me before, in terms of like, there are people going, like it used to be, here people going through similar forms of marginalization, and here is fictional ideation about how they can respond to it. Where Krakoa is kind of proposing this ideal of like almost like gas in the tank in terms of like what we're working for, like set like a model of.
It's not just an empowerment fantasy. It's a sustainment. Sustainment. That's not a word.
I mean, all words are anything you say.
Yeah, it's not just an empowerment fantasy. It's a sustainability fantasy. It's a refuge fantasy. It's a celebratory fantasy.
Yeah. Cool. So I saw we have 10 minutes. So if folks want to throw their questions in, now is the time.
Yeah. Let's see what we've got. All right. Well, we've got one question that was already answered in the chat, and then a reminder that we have 10 minutes left in the questions so far. So again, yeah, if you have questions or if you have stuff to throw in or ideas, now is a great time. I want to add too in the chat, folks were dropping Twitter handles earlier. If there were people who wanted to stay connected over stuff like this, I'd also encourage anyone, because I know I'm recognizing names in here, and I know there are folks here who work with aid organizations or who work with nonprofits or who do advocacy work, that if you have relevant links or ideas, the chat is a great place to just throw those in. Man, I love the role that the chat is playing in sort of the dialogue around panels and in this, because it's allowing for whole parallel conversations that usually sort of happen in actuallys in Q&A but like hugely interesting and cool and productive ones.
Yeah.
And while I'm at it, let me drop the slides in there.
So I'm just dropping some links to organizations that like I personally like super love and always want to boost up. I'm also going to be dropping a resources by state. But yeah, feel free to like throw any LGBTQ youth or even just like general youth facing organizations. I think like this, again, an interesting part of kind of where we had our conversation of like not really having answers. That was something that I felt like we recognize as like a limitation for the conversation, is that there's no way to really like there's no thesis, right? Like we are trying to explore these ideas and trying to raise really inciting and catalyzing questions.
Alternately, everyone can get out early. We can just let class out 5 minutes early. But yeah, so I encourage folks to check out those links. Keep networking, keep connecting, and keep asking questions.
And keep asking yourself like what you need. Oh, got a Q&A. Okay. Okay, not mutant question. Self-advocacy feels extra hard when a kid is both neurodiverse and trans. Thoughts on that intersection?
Yes.
Yeah, many.
Yeah.
Jay, do you want to go first, or do you want to?
I mean, I think that's an intersection that both of us live at. So it's something that's definitely come up a lot. And I think a lot of the same principles are at play. In terms of support, you definitely want to look at points of intersection. I agree with the self-advocacy question. I know, for instance, that there are a lot of things that for me as a teen, I would have really welcomed and appreciated from adults and mentors that might normally be stepping on toes in terms of advocacy and in terms of involvement. I would do more offering and more asking. I think something that can can come up for neurodivergent kids, and obviously this depends very much on the vector of neurodivergence that we're talking about. But a lot of the time you've got kids who might have trouble formulating what to ask for, might have trouble articulating questions, and also might have been told or grown up being told that their questions and the things they ask for aren't reasonable things to ask for, and so have sort of those down. So something that I try to do when I'm working with kids at that intersection is to do a lot of asking questions and to do a lot of making offers, to outline, this is a specific thing that I could do. Would that be useful? Is this something, you know, what would you like to see come out of this? What's you know, what are resources we could do, or places to go with this, etc. And to frame it as asking questions, and to definitely not have it be waiting to be asked for support.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Alana's point, they said this is more statement than question. Always good, always panel semiotics there. But on a serious note, a lot of us are more comfortable advocating for others than ourselves, but we can use that to support each other. That's like kind of the core lesson of my life. Again, like, I think it really will depend on what specific form of neurodivergence we're talking about, because like, we're not necessarily like monolithic in that way, but I know, like, I can speak from my experience as a heavily traumatized, abused person with autism. My life had really taught me, and my environment had really taught me to sublimate my needs, which is a compounding challenge when I already feel like verbally communicating my needs is an explicit challenge. And so, kind of to Jay's point, I have always really benefited from spaces that ask me the same question, even if I've already given an answer. And I think that when I work with youth, that is something that I'm constantly doing. I'm saying the unsaid, which is really big for youth. And I know so many well-intentioned cisgender parents of trans kids who like had a conversation once about like, it's okay to come out in this environment. And then like years down the road, their kid moves out and like they come out like within a year. And I think I'm constantly wondering, like, are we giving enough space and reminder? Because personally, I have object permanence issues with nearly everything. So you tell me something today, if I don't have it written down, I'm not going to remember it at all. And so like reaffirming those things constantly is really helpful. Asking inciting questions, asking productive questions, you know, holding space for them to also not know and to not be certain is really important. And I think that can be one of the biggest, I mean, that was kind of one of the biggest things for me that kept me, other than my environment, kept me in the closet in my youth, was the fact that there were so many unknowns and I didn't have the language yet to understand what it was that was being felt innately. So I just stayed in the closet because I didn't have the language to be sure-footed in coming out. And that was a challenge for me.
Yeah, I think that's something that kept me in the closet into my 30s. Was that specific intersection of the, I have to be sure, and I also have to have the most precise language possible, and fixating on that need.
Yeah. And I think like the biggest thing I would kind of culminate by saying for like neurodivergent trans youth is as often as possible, like, affirm agency. There's an intersection. There are also moments where those two parts of that person will diverge, and you need to be really intentional about, you know, it's a fine line. Ask a lot of inciting questions, but don't ask them the same question multiple times if they're giving really like firm and confident answers. You don't want to ever be like unknowingly gaslighting your child out of something that they feel.
Yeah. Being honest about your own uncertainties can be really, really powerful there too. I think there's a sense of adults having their shit together and having a degree of certainty that it's very, very valuable to break. It's very valuable to say, I know I already asked you this, but I need that reassurance.
Yeah.
Too.
tool. I feel like just be comfortable acknowledging where the limits of your experience and your understanding and your resources are.
Yeah. Speaking of advocacy tools, I'm going to drop a link to one of my favorite books in the world, which is if you are looking at doing the kind of education work that we were talking about before, if you're talking to schools, if you're talking to people and doing Trans 101 with people of any age, it is one of the best resources I've ever found. In terms of basic language, in terms of basic theory, and in terms of just being an incredibly positive, inclusive, and affirming book.
Hey, y'all. I feel very bad jumping in, but we need to wrap it up, unfortunately, and clear out the room for the next event. But I want to thank you all. This was an incredible panel. I don't, if you guys want to continue a conversation, there are lounges, and we're trying to get people to go to the upper floors. So I'm encouraging everyone here to visit the 3rd and 4th floors of the main hall. They were a little slow yesterday. Give them the same love that the lower floors get. Our next panel is Fans Fight Back. It'll be starting around 2 p.m. All are welcome. If you all want to say your goodbyes, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who came in. Dani, thank you so much for doing this with me. This has been
thank you, Jay.
A really incredible panel to be on. So I'm actually going to sneak out and go to another panel, so I'm not going to be doing discussion in the lounges afterwards. But
yes, I am also going to another panel.
All right, so take care. Keep having conversations. Both of our Twitter handles are in those slides, which we link to in the general chat. But I'm going to stick mine in the chat as well, so that it's just there. Dani, if you want to do the same.
Oh my goodness, yes. Sorry, I recently changed it. Give me 1 second.
Ooh, I think I know it. I think it's D Kinney 001, right?
Yes. Nope. There it is. Somebody literally DM'd me. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
Take care. Stay awesome.